By 1793, France had transformed into a nation unrecognizable from the kingdom Louis XVI had known as sovereign. The revolution, which began in 1789 with promises of liberty, equality, and fraternity, had degenerated into the Terror, a period of systematic violence against supposed enemies of the Republic. The guillotine became a symbol of revolutionary justice, its blade falling daily on the necks of nobles, clergy, and anyone deemed a counter-revolutionary. The economic crisis that had helped spark the revolution continued to plague the nation. Bread shortages remained common, inflation ravaged ordinary families, and the ongoing war against European monarchies drained the treasury that the revolutionaries had hoped to restore. In this atmosphere of crisis and uncertainty, the people demanded scapegoats, and the remaining members of the royal family provided convenient targets for their fury. The political landscape had shifted dramatically since the storming of the Bastille. Moderate voices, which had initially guided the revolution, were silenced or eliminated, replaced by radical factions led by figures such as Maximilien Robespierre and Jacques Hébert. These individuals believed that the revolution could only be saved through the complete annihilation of its enemies, and they were willing to use any means to achieve this goal. The Committee of Public Safety, established in April 1793, became the de facto government of France, wielding unprecedented power over life and death. Under Robespierre's influence, the committee adopted a policy of systematic terror against all perceived enemies of the Republic. No one was safe from accusation, trial, and execution. Neither former nobles, moderate revolutionaries, nor even loyal Republicans who fell out of favor due to shifting political winds. The trial and execution of Louis XVI must be understood within this broader context of revolutionary violence. He was not merely the victim of personal hatred, though such hatred undoubtedly existed. Rather, he was the victim of a political system that had embraced violence as a tool of governance and social transformation. Revolutionaries believed that only by utterly destroying the old order could they construct a new society based on their ideals. The international dimension of the conflict also played a crucial role in Louis XVI's fate. As a king whose power was historically linked to dynasties across Europe, he was seen as a symbol of counter-revolutionary resistance and a potential figure for the restoration of the monarchy. The ongoing war against European monarchies provided additional justification for treating him as an enemy of the state, rather than merely a fallen king deserving of mercy. The Temple Tower, located in the heart of Paris, had served as a residence for centuries, but never before had it held prisoners as high profile as those during the Terror. Originally part of an ancient abbey, it had been transformed into a fortress and then a royal residence before becoming the monarch's place of incarceration. Its thick stone walls and confined spaces were not designed for the permanent habitation of the king, who had once commanded armies and lived in palatial luxury. Louis XVI arrived at the Temple on August 13, 1792, with his family, transferred from the Tuileries after the overthrow of the monarchy. The transfer itself was significant. While at the Tuileries, he still retained some elements of royal authority. At the Temple, he became an ordinary prisoner. He was assigned a room on the upper floor of the Grand Tower, a limited and gloomy space, with small barred windows providing the only source of natural light. The physical conditions of his imprisonment were deliberately harsh. The room contained only the simplest furniture, a bed, a table, and a few chairs. Guards constantly watched him day and night. The guards were ordered to prevent any attempt at suicide or escape, and they took their duty seriously, never allowing a moment of privacy. This constant surveillance was both a security measure and a form of psychological torture. The dampness of the prison almost immediately affected his health. Having spent years in the heated, well-ventilated apartments of Versailles, Louis XVI was unprepared for the humid, cold conditions of his cell. Within days of his arrival, he developed a persistent cough, and he began to show signs of the physical exhaustion that would characterize his last months. Poor sanitation and limited access to hygiene further undermined his health and dignity. His daily routine became a monotonous cycle of meals, short periods of exercise, and long hours of waiting. Breakfast consisted of a cup of coffee or chocolate with bread. Lunch was usually soup with bread, and dinner offered little more variety. The quality of the food was poor by any measure, but especially shocking for one accustomed to the finest cuisine in Europe. He rapidly lost weight, and his complexion became pale and sickly. The psychological impact of imprisonment was perhaps even more devastating than the physical deprivations. Louis XVI was separated from his children and wife, though they were housed in the same tower with limited contact. He received only sporadic news of their well-being and did not know how they were being treated. The isolation was almost complete. He was allowed few visitors, and those who came were thoroughly vetted by the authorities. His lawyers, Desez, Malherbe, and Tronchet, later described the profound sadness and resignation they observed in their client. He seemed to understand that his fate had already been decided, and that the upcoming trial would be merely a formality designed to provide legal justification for a predetermined outcome. The guards who served during his imprisonment later testified to his dignity in these impossible circumstances. Despite his obvious suffering, he maintained a calm demeanor that impressed even those ordered to consider him an enemy of the people. He thanked the guards for small courtesies and never complained about his treatment, though he had myriad reasons to protest the conditions of his confinement. The trial of Louis XVI, which began on December 11, 1792, represented one of the most egregious perversions of justice in the annals of legal history. The Revolutionary Tribunal, established to swiftly administer justice to enemies of the Republic, had already proven its willingness to condemn prisoners on the flimsiest of evidence. In Louis XVI's case, the outcome was predetermined by political necessity rather than legal proof, turning the proceedings into a carefully orchestrated performance designed to justify a decision already made. The charges against the former king were a mix of the absurd and the politically motivated. The most serious accusations included conspiring with foreign enemies, financing émigrés, and various forms of treason against the French nation. However, the indictment also included ludicrous claims such as attempts to flee and an unwillingness to cooperate with the constitutional monarchy, which were presented as undeniable proofs of betrayal. The evidence against him came primarily from those whose own survival depended on their cooperation with the revolutionary authorities. Former servants, members of the National Guard, and even casual acquaintances were called to provide evidence of his alleged crimes. Much of their testimony was based on rumor, hearsay, or deliberate misrepresentation of events that had occurred years earlier. The standards of evidence that might have applied in ordinary criminal trials were entirely discarded. His lawyers faced an impossible task. They were given only a few days to prepare for the trial, and they were denied access to most of the documents and witnesses that could have supported their client's case. The tribunal showed no interest in hearing evidence that might contradict the predetermined narrative of Louis XVI's guilt. When the lawyers attempted to challenge the prosecution's evidence, they were often interrupted and dismissed. The public gallery was packed with spectators eager to witness the humiliation of the former king. Many had waited for hours for a chance to see the man they blamed for their suffering brought low before revolutionary justice. Their presence created an atmosphere more akin to a theatrical performance than a legal proceeding, with audience members applauding the prosecution and jeering the defense. Louis XVI himself maintained remarkable composure throughout the trial. Contemporary accounts describe him as pale and visibly ill, but dignified in his responses to even the most outrageous accusations. When confronted with charges of treason, he reportedly responded with a clarity and conviction that surprised many. His calm demeanor in the face of such attacks may have impressed some observers, but it did nothing to alter the predetermined outcome. The prosecution largely relied on letters and documents that were either forged or taken out of context. Correspondence with foreign monarchs was presented as proof of treacherous conspiracy, while private expressions of concern for his family were twisted into evidence of counter-revolutionary plotting. The revolutionary authorities were not interested in distinguishing between legitimate family concerns and actual political activity. The outcome of the trial was fixed from the beginning. On January 17th, after less than 2 days of deliberation, the convention rendered its verdict: guilty on all charges, with a sentence of death to be carried out immediately. The speed of the verdict shocked even some supporters of the revolution, who had expected at least a semblance of careful deliberation. Instead, the trial served its purpose, providing legal cover for a political execution that had been planned for months. The night of January 21, 1793, was the longest of Louis XVI's life, as he confronted the reality that his execution would take place the following morning. The guilty verdict had been rendered on the 20th, and he was immediately returned to his cell to await death. The brevity of time between sentence and execution was deliberate. Revolutionary authorities wanted to prevent any possibility of rescue attempts or popular demonstrations that might develop if he were allowed to remain in prison longer. His farewell letter, written to his people and especially to his family, though not fully delivered in its original form, reveals the deep faith and resignation that characterized his final hours. Despite the hatred surrounding him, he wrote of forgiving those who condemned him and expressed hope that his death would bring peace to France. This letter, one of the most poignant documents of his final ordeal, demonstrates the surprising spiritual strength he had developed during months of imprisonment. The guards who watched over him in those final hours later testified to his composure and dignity. He spent much of the night in prayer and reflection, occasionally making notes that would be confiscated and destroyed by the authorities. Despite obvious fear and sadness, he maintained the demeanor that had been instilled in him since childhood, the duty of a monarch to face even death with grace and courage. Sleep came only fitfully that long night. The knowledge that morning would bring his death, combined with the constant presence of guards and the sounds of preparation outside his cell, made rest almost impossible. He could hear the movement of carts and the gathering of crowds in the streets beyond the prison walls. These sounds served as a constant reminder that thousands eagerly awaited his execution. Physical preparations for the execution began even before dawn. His hair, which had grown long during months of imprisonment, was cut short again so that nothing would impede the guillotine's blade. This final humiliation, to be prepared for death like a sheep for slaughter, represented the complete dehumanization that the revolutionaries sought to impose on their victims. He was no longer a king, not even merely a man, but only a body to be processed by the machine of revolutionary justice. His request for a priest was only partially granted. He was able to have a final mass with a non-juring priest, which was another subtle humiliation designed to emphasize the revolutionary rejection of traditional religious authority. Nevertheless, Louis XVI maintained his religious principles, finding solace in the face of death. Breakfast, served to him on his last morning, consisted of a cup of chocolate and a piece of bread. A simple meal that underscored the dramatic change in his circumstances compared to the lavish morning rituals of Versailles. He ate little, having lost much of his appetite during months of confinement. His hands trembled as he raised the cup to his lips, the only outward sign of the terror he must have been experiencing as the moment of execution approached. As dawn broke over Paris on January 21, 1793, Louis XVI confronted the reality that he would not live to see the next sunset. The man who had once awakened in silk sheets, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting and servants, now prepared to meet death in a damp prison cell under the gaze of hostile guards. The transformation was complete, from king to condemned prisoner, in less than 4 years. At 10 a.m. on January 21, 1793, the executioner's assistants arrived at Louis XVI's cell to begin the final preparations for his journey to the scaffold. The process was designed to maximize his humiliation and demonstrate the complete triumph of revolutionary justice over royal privilege. Every detail was carefully orchestrated to ensure his final moments served as a powerful symbol of the revolution's victory over the old order. His hands were tied behind his back with thick rope, a procedure that caused him obvious discomfort but was deemed necessary to prevent any attempt at escape or self-harm. The binding was tight enough to impede circulation, causing his fingers to swell and turn blue. This physical discomfort was intentional. The revolutionaries wanted him to suffer in plain sight, making his final journey through the streets of Paris, demonstrating to the crowds that even kings could be reduced to common criminals. The cart that arrived to take him to the Place de la Révolution was a deliberate insult to his former status. Instead of the gilded carriage that had once carried him to balls and ceremonies at Versailles, he was loaded into a crude wooden cart, the same type used to transport ordinary criminals to their execution. The wooden planks were rough and uncomfortable, forcing him to sit unsupported as the cart bounced over the cobblestones of Paris. The route from the Temple to the Place de la Révolution was carefully chosen to maximize the public spectacle of his downfall. The procession moved through some of the most densely populated areas of Paris, ensuring that thousands of citizens had the opportunity to witness the former king's final journey. Mounted guards surrounded the cart, both to prevent any rescue attempts and to maintain order among the crowds lining the streets. The crowds gathered to watch his passage displayed a mixture of curiosity, hatred, and celebratory revelry that shocked even some contemporaries. Many people brought their children to witness the historic event, viewing the execution of a king as a form of entertainment and education. Vendors sold food and drinks to spectators, creating a carnival-like atmosphere that stood in stark contrast to the solemnity of the occasion. Contemporary accounts described Louis XVI's demeanor during this final journey as remarkably calm. Despite the jeers and insults hurled at him by the crowd, he maintained an upright posture and stared straight ahead, refusing to give his tormentors the satisfaction of seeing him broken. This dignity in the face of such humiliation impressed even some of his enemies, who had expected to see him crumble under the pressure of public abasement. The artist Jacques-Louis David, who supported the revolution and was tasked with documenting major events, made sketches of Louis XVI during his final journey. His drawings show a man who appears older than his 38 years, with hollowed cheeks and weary eyes, but still possessing an unmistakable semblance of nobility despite his desperate circumstances. These images became some of the most powerful visual records of the revolution's impact on its victims. The journey took approximately an hour, during which Louis XVI was subjected to constant verbal abuse from the crowds. People shouted accusations, curses, and threats, creating a cacophony of hatred that must have been overwhelming. Some observers noted that he seemed to pray silently for much of the way, his lips moving slightly as he sought solace in his faith in these last moments of his life. The Place de la Révolution, formerly known as Place Louis XV and now called Place de la Concorde, had been transformed into an amphitheater of death by the time Louis XVI's cart arrived around 10:20 a.m. The guillotine, painted red to obscure the bloodstains from previous executions, stood in the center of the square like a grotesque altar of revolutionary justice. Thousands of spectators filled the square and surrounding rooftops, creating a sea of faces eager to witness the final act of the royal drama. The scaffold itself was raised so that everyone in the crowd could clearly see the execution. This elevation served both practical and symbolic purposes. It allowed for better crowd control while emphasizing the public nature of revolutionary justice. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, had carried out dozens of executions during the Terror, but he would later write that Louis XVI's execution was one of the most challenging of his career due to the immense pressure and public scrutiny. As the cart reached the foot of the scaffold, Louis XVI was helped down by the executioner's assistants. Contemporary witnesses noted that he seemed unsteady on his feet, whether from weakness, fear, or the effects of his prolonged imprisonment. His simple clothes, once clean but now soiled from the journey, contrasted sharply with his former royal regalia. The crowd pressed forward eagerly to catch every detail of his final moments. The crowd's reaction to his appearance on the scaffold was mixed. While many continued to jeer and shout insults, others fell silent, perhaps moved by the sight of a man facing death with such composure. Some contemporary accounts describe a momentary hush that fell over the crowd as they realized they were witnessing a truly historic moment, the execution of the King of France, an event that would have been unimaginable just a few years prior. The final preparations for the execution were carried out with efficient brutality. His hair was arranged so that nothing would impede the blade's path. The executioner's assistants, with practiced precision, positioned him on the scaffold, having performed this ritual countless times. Despite their experience, the significance of the moment was not lost on them. This was no ordinary criminal, but a man who had once ruled France. In his last seconds, Louis XVI looked out at the crowd gathered to witness his death. What thoughts passed through his mind in these final moments can only be conjectured. Perhaps memories of his children, thoughts of his wife, or reflections on the dramatic changes that had transformed France from a kingdom into a republic. The contrast between this moment and the day of his coronation, when he was a young and hopeful monarch, could not have been more stark. At 10:22 a.m., the blade of the guillotine fell, severing Louis XVI's life and closing one of the most dramatic chapters in French history. The roar of approval from the crowd was immediate and deafening, a sound that echoed through the streets of Paris and marked the symbolic end of the old regime. The man once called King of France was now merely another victim of the revolution he had unwittingly helped create. The immediate aftermath of Louis XVI's execution revealed the complex and conflicting emotions his death stirred within the French populace. While crowds in the Place de la Révolution celebrated with apparent enthusiasm, viewing his death as a victory for the common people, other reactions were more subdued. Even some supporters of the revolution privately questioned whether the execution of a king, regardless of his alleged crimes, represented the better ideals of their movement. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, lifted his severed head to the crowd as was custom, prompting another roar of approval from the spectators. However, his later writings revealed his personal discomfort with the execution, describing Louis as having maintained dignity to the very end and expressing regret that political necessity demanded his death. His account provides one of the most reliable contemporary descriptions of his last moments and suggests that even those responsible for carrying out the execution were troubled by its implications. The burial of his body followed the same procedures as for other executed criminals. He was interred in an unmarked grave in the Madeleine Cemetery. His remains were mingled with quicklime to accelerate decomposition. This treatment represented the ultimate denial of his royal status. In death, he was afforded no more reverence than the most common criminal. The revolutionaries wished to ensure that his grave could not become a shrine for counter-revolutionary sentiment. International reaction to his execution was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. European monarchs, who had remained neutral in the conflict between France and its neighbors, now began to view the French Revolution as a direct threat to the very institution of monarchy. The execution of Louis XVI made it clear that the revolutionaries were willing to destroy not only the French monarchy, but the very concept of kingship, making compromise with other European powers increasingly difficult. The propaganda value of his execution for the revolutionaries was significant but temporary. His death served as proof that no one was above revolutionary justice and that the old order had been utterly destroyed. However, it also marked the beginning of a period of even greater violence and instability that would ultimately consume many of the revolutionaries themselves. The precedent of executing a former monarch would return to haunt France as the revolution spiraled into increasing extremism. Within France, his execution held different meanings for different groups. For the urban poor, who had suffered under the old regime, his death represented justice for years of oppression and neglect. For the peasantry, who were less directly affected by royal policies, the execution was more symbolic than personally significant. For the remaining aristocracy and clergy, it served as a terrifying reminder of their own vulnerability in revolutionary France. The children he left behind became pawns in the ongoing political struggle. His son, Louis Charles, recognized by royalists as Louis XVII, remained imprisoned under increasingly harsh conditions that ultimately contributed to his death in 1795. His daughter, Marie-Thérèse, survived her imprisonment and would later become a symbol of royal restoration, but she never forgot the trauma of witnessing her family's destruction during the Terror.